There are folks joining us from all over at least the island and the world, so welcome to everyone who's joining us remotely. My name is Darren Collins. I'm the president and an alumnus of the College of the Atlantic, and I'm very excited to welcome you all to our second coffee and conversation of the season with another alum, Michael Diaz-Griffith from the class of '09, and a very special interlocutor in Beth Gardiner. And we want to hear from them, obviously, but my role is to welcome you all, and you got to give me 5 minutes to also welcome Beth. Beth grew up in California, and she came east and went to Duke University. And we can't blame her for that. That's fine. You know, there is a great college. Beth would have been an unbelievable COA student, right? First, 3 reasons why. First, we love people who are scrappy and get stuff done, right? And Beth definitely gets stuff done. For 12 years, she was at NBC and worked from a desk assistant up to an award-winning producer. And that shows that the woman gets stuff done. Secondly, she's got range, right? This insatiable curiosity, which I also think is common to all, if not most, COA students. And I think this is evidence in her work on export porcelain. Beth is an expert and an authority on the movement of porcelain from Asia to Europe from the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries. And most recently, she's been working on porcelain that came from a shipwreck called, I just lost
Espedarte.
Espedarte, thank you, which means swordfish in Portuguese, which is great. And I just think it's an excellent example of someone who looks at the material world and understands humanity and the relationship between humans and their surroundings through a part of the natural world. Finally, she just cares. She really cares. And COA students definitely care. She's a wonderful, caring mother. And her other half, Will's not here. We love Will too. Will's a great guy. And we've just loved to come to know Beth and her family. And although she would have been a great COA student, we're super excited to welcome her as the next board chair of the College of the Atlantic. Yeah.
Thank you.
And she'll start that role officially on the 23rd, Friday,
right.
The 23rd of this month. Before I hand it over, there's one other thing I have to do. We do this coffee and conversation partially to think differently about the world, right? And we do this also to give thanks to the people who support us so much, like everyone in this room. In that spirit of giving thanks, it's also really important that we recognize or think differently about the Wabanaki people who have been coming here to this island for many, many millennia, and everything that they have imparted on this wonderful space. And across 50 years, we haven't done enough as an institution, and I promise you that as we look forward, you're going to see some remarkable work. And so I just think that it's important that we recognize or think differently about the people who have made this place their home for millennium. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Michael and Beth and you. So thanks, everyone.
Thank you very much, Darren.
Thanks, Darren.
Thank you very much, and welcome everybody to today's Coffee and Conversation entitled The New Antiquarians with Michael Diaz-Griffith. Before we dive in, I want to thank all of you here who've made an effort to get up and come here this morning, and also to everybody joining us remotely. And a note to those of you who are remote, we're thrilled to have you with us, but because you're not here in the flesh, you won't be able to experience this beautiful new building that we've just opened, the Davis Center for Human Ecology, which is a pleasure to be in. And in a word, it's stunning. So we welcome all of you to come visit it soon. Now to Michael. One of the perks of the job of being a trustee at the College of the Atlantic is when you're asked to host a discussion with someone like Michael. His enthusiasm, evangelism, and passion for the art world, art history, and historic objects is contagious, and you're just about to experience it yourself. Michael is also a graduate of the College of the Atlantic from the class of 2009. His interests and achievements in the world of art history are vast, including a period as Associate Executive Director at the Winter Show in New York City, one of the most important antique shows in the world. Currently, Michael is the Executive Director of the Sohn Foundation in New York, an extension of the Sir John Soane's Museum in London. In essence, Michael's work in New York is to support the museum in London when it comes to fundraising, outreach, scholarships, and a whole host of other areas. Michael took that job in 2020, and in response to the appointment, the magazine Antiques called him one of our field's brightest young stars. In 2020, he was named one of House Beautiful's visionaries for his advocacy of historic art, material culture, and preservation. That followed Michael's founding of the New Antiquarians, hence the name of today's Coffee and Conversation. It's a group of young enthusiasts in the antiques world focusing on the exchange of ideas. I know from living in London and my work in the world of art history that the Soane Museum is iconic. It was opened in the late 19th century by the English architect, Sir John Soane. And today, it is arguably one of the most well-loved and respected small museums in the United Kingdom. Visitors and scholars alike often cite it as their favorite museum. It's also idiosyncratic. It's eclectic. So let's start by setting the scene by having Michael describe to us the Sir John Soane Museum in Lincoln's Inn Fields in the heart of London.
Well, thank you for that wonderfully kind introduction, Beth. I'm not sure anyone has ever said so many nice things about me in such a brief period of time, but I'm very grateful for it. Raise your hand if you've been to the Soane Museum in London. Okay, we've got a few, which is really pleasing. The Soane Museum, as Beth said, is both a national institution and a sort of iconic landmark in the world of British museums, but globally, it's one of the supreme examples of a house museum. So it has sort of different statuses depending on what your perspective is. Architects look to it for inspiration because Soane, the architect who built it, was innovative, an independent thinker, and imbued the buildings that the museum is located in with incredible creativity and vision in the early 19th century. Those who are interested in objects are fascinated by the antiquities and plaster casts that are collected in the museum. They're there because Soane was a professor at the Royal Academy. And so he used the museum as a laboratory for his students. They were invited into the museum to learn about antiquity, to think creatively about it, and also to see the work of their teacher. And it's also a repository for a really important collection of art, works by Canaletto, Hogarth, Turner, Piranesi, the list goes on. There are over 30,000 architectural drawings housed in the museum, collected by Soane. And I could go on and on for days. But what's really interesting, you used the word idiosyncrasy, the museum is a total work of art. So while it's a sort of iconic example of all of these really, really beautiful, it's sort of both really important, I'll put that word in scare quotes, but the way that the objects, the architecture, and the atmosphere of the museum sort of mix together in your experience make it a sort of total work of art. It's a really immersive atmosphere to move through. And so among all of those distinguishing factors is just the experience of being in it. And I think being, at least in my case, constantly overwhelmed by the interest and beauty there.
So I was wondering, many of you probably have visited the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum in Boston, which by its decree, nothing can change in it. Everything is frozen in space, which makes that a very unique experience.
Mm-hmm.
And I wondered, is it the same at the John Soane Museum, or has it been a conscious decision of the trustees to keep it in the way? Because if you've been there, you really, it is an experience. You are walking back in time. And it's very almost Victorian, and all
Yeah.
these artifacts and things, which I think that's why people often cite it as their favorite museum, because it's a whole experience, emotional experience, obviously scholarly experience. And how did that come to be?
Yeah, no, there's a sort of trapped in amber quality about much of the museum. There are also new exhibition galleries that we Americans helped fund. And so there's an exciting contemporary program, all of the things a museum needs now in order to interact successfully with its community. But what drew me to it was that trapped in amber quality. And indeed, that is built into the charter of the museum. It's not as strict as the Isabella Stewart Gardner, but there's a phrase that it needs to be kept as near as possible,
Mhm.
To the state that it was in when Soane left it. And a bit of juicy gossip. Soane negotiated the charter for the museum with Parliament in the early 1830s. Now, a part of the reason for this is because he created this, singular space, and he wanted to pass it on to the British public in perpetuity for their use and enjoyment. But he also had a very naughty son who was, we could talk about him for all day, but he was not a very savory character. And Soane was really determined that he not inherit the house and museum. So he was an extremely resourceful fellow, and he worked with Parliament to establish this act, which is one of a kind, that brought the museum into public ownership upon his death, with this proviso that it should be kept as near as possible, intact as near as it possibly could be. So, yeah.
So Michael's job, I think, is unique. It's unusual. It's not unheard of, but it's unusual that a small British museum would have an anchor in the United States.
Mm.
And he has a very important role when it comes to the nuances in funding, supporting the outreach of the museum to all of us here in the United States. I find that very exciting because I love cross-cultural dialogues. I think that's a very exciting thing. So tell us a little bit about you and what you do as the Sohn Foundation in New York.
Sure. So, as you allude to, fundraising is at the basis of all that we do, because we're here to support the museum in London and to do whatever we can to help them. For years, Americans have been at the vanguard of funding the newer projects in London. And, that's something that I think we find in other American friends of organizations, the sort of resourceful Americans who want to help out. We could actually conduct a whole history of that pattern in philanthropy and in the museum world. But what's really fun about the Sohn Foundation in particular is that it's always convened a group of architects and designers in the United States around it. And those folks are both, they want to support the museum in London, but they're also particularly inspired by it in their work. So we have, a really rich and vibrant community around the foundation and the museum, art historians, those who are simply interested in helping the museum achieve its goals. But we also have, designers, architects who are constantly in dialogue with the museum as a source of design inspiration. And I think that's a sort of unique part of our DNA that we want to try to bring even more to the fore. We could sort of sit here and talk about buildings in the US that have been inspired by Soane, inspired by the Soane Museum. And so in that cross-cultural dialogue, there's not just an art historical discussion, although that's very important, but a sort of practice-engaged discussion that yields really beautiful real-world kind of results. And so I think that's what's particularly special.
What is your vision for the foundation? Obviously, the pandemic slowed everything down,
Yeah.
screeched all of us to a halt. And I'm sure you had lots of time to think about what your dreams are, your hopes for the foundation, in the next year and coming forward. And tell us a little bit about what your vision is and also how all of us can engage.
Brilliant. Yeah. Well, I joined during the first week of quarantine. So I was set to go into the office and then was forbidden by law from doing so. So that was interesting. And, I think the first thing I did, and we could talk a bit about the sort of COA connections in everything we discussed today, but I wanted to get to know the museum even better. I was not able to go there though. And so I, immediately began building relationships with those at the museum that I hadn't met before. And one of our most important role in the past year has been to help the museum make it through the pandemic. And, as you know, as a British national institution, they receive help from the government. There are wonderful people supporting the museum in the UK. But this year has really shown the museum and our audience in America that we are integral to helping it survive in a year like this. And so that was a very steep hill to climb, but we did it, and we did it mostly through building relationships, both with the museum to find out what they needed, what they really needed this year, and to be very sort of plain and direct in offering unrestrained support for whatever they needed, and then communicating that to our American audience and building a fundraising campaign around it. So that was the sort of urgent need of the day. In terms of the outlook for us, we want to do much, much more in the US in terms of outreach. So we already support fellowships. We have a travel program that we'll be reconvening soon that will allow supporters to visit the museum and other destinations of sort of art historical and architectural historical interest. And we also host a really lovely lecture series that I always attended in New York, even before I was involved in the Sohn Foundation. And so we want to build all of those programs. We have a new website coming in 2 months that will be a wonderful platform for them. We'll keep building them, growing, engaging. And I would just encourage everyone to log on to sohnfoundation.org to see what's up, especially in a couple of months, because we have a really special sort of new resource that's being developed that will allow people to connect more deeply with the museum, and also, it sort of unlocks the Soanean world in America. And, at the basis of what we do is this interest in design innovation that's related to this community of architects and designers that have supported the foundation. And so to sort of connect this to the other things we'll discuss, it's not just that the foundation or the museum are interested in history. We love history, and we are passionately engaged with the study of it. But there's always this sort of edge of wanting to think about history in a new way, coming to it from a fresh angle, which is what Soane did, and also trying to sort of communicate that in a way that will be compelling for people who haven't been to the museum, who still need to visit. Yeah.
So I'm particularly interested in how museums support scholars, because I'm a huge believer in scholarship, studying, understanding, particularly when it comes to objects. In this case, sounds like lots of designers, architects. And I have to say, one thing I know about living in London and the Soane Museum, the breadth of its reach is vast. It's not just architects, it's interior designers, it's members of parliament.
Textile designers, architectural historians. Yeah, no. And in London, there's a very deep and rich community that's convened around the museum. Literary characters, fashion designers. Erdem, the fashion designer, is very inspired by the museum, so much so that he's held several presentations there at his request. And there was recently a really lovely conversation between him and a fashion critic at the museum. And you think, what's the connection to Soane? But there are many. And I think in every period of its history, the Soane Museum has sort of catalyzed interest with equal success among different groups. And it's because there's so much there each generation finds something to be fascinated by. And on a disciplinary level, I think people from all sorts of backgrounds find something to be fascinated by. I mean, it's clearly everyone who hasn't been has to go. Call me. We'll make plans for you to visit.
Tell us about the effects of the pandemic on the museum, because I think that's something, now that we've all been through the pandemic, we're all learning to live with it and the repercussions of it. It has to have changed the way that the museum functioned. Michael and I obviously talked before today, and he told me that the museum was open 25 days last year.
Yeah.
That's for an institution which is supposed to be open to the public. That's crazy. So tell us, what, I think we probably all have a very good idea of what happened. What will happen going forward?
So in the UK, as you know, Beth, government support for cultural institutions has been declining now for decades, and not necessarily sort of dollar for dollar or pound for pound, but compared to in the past, institutions like the Soane Museum, the Victoria and Albert Museum, are having to increasingly rely on private philanthropy to meet their goals. So that's a narrative that has been brewing for decades. It's nothing new. And perhaps the most frightening moment at the beginning of the pandemic was when, knowing what that decline has been, there was a great deal of uncertainty about how the government would step in to help museums, not just the Soane, but all of the British national institutions. And so on the foundation side, we certainly rushed to try to help fill in what seemed to be a widening gap that the museum would face in the coming year. And the gap really was from being unable to operate its commercial enterprises, event rentals, the museum shop. You'd be surprised by how much museum gift stores earn for their institutions. And they have to. That's built into the government's thinking about how much they'll fund these institutions. So long story short, we sort of rushed to fill the gap. We succeeded. We helped do that, which felt great. And then the government did step in and was quite generous and has extended that support into 2021, as you know. And so we find ourselves in a much better position financially. And that allows the museum and the foundation to begin dreaming again about what we'll do next. There are, in the US, there are numerous possibilities, but I mean, just one to give an example is that we might be able to travel some of the works in the Soane to America, and maybe even have to pop up spaces that are sort of redolent of that Soane Museum atmosphere. Collaborate with architects and designers on that. The possibilities are endless, but as we come out of this sort of lean year, I think we're beginning to think of real, those more dynamic ideas again for engagement. At the museum, something happened that I thought was really interesting. Because of social distancing regulations, the museum had to institute timed ticketing, which we're all used to from all sorts of arenas, including going up Cadillac Mountain, as I learned yesterday. And the museum was incredibly creative about how they instituted it, though. Soane had written a document that expressed an ideal route through the museum for a sort of fictional visitor. He did a lot of this kind of thing. And that document was always studied. It's interesting, but the museum had never instituted a kind of ticketing that would allow for visitors to be guided very precisely through, according to this vision set forth by Soane. So this year they tried it out. And I thought that was a really special experience that people were able to have. If you bought a timed ticket, you were set on a route that was really in accordance with Soane's idea about how to experience the museum. And because it's changed so little in the core of the museum, they were really seeing exactly what Soane wanted them to see. And that was, and now that will pass, a sort of regular attendance will pick up. And so.
So interesting. I wanted to ask, why set up the Sohn Foundation in the US? It's very interesting to me. You could, it's a European institution. You could set it up in Paris. There's many other places, and yet you decided to send it up in New York. Why?
So in the 1980s and 90s, as we all remember or maybe have studied, the tax structures in the US and the UK changed a great deal in a relatively short period of time. And I'm going to be very frank with you and with the audience today. The tax incentive for Americans to donate to anything, to engage in any kind of philanthropy, were much greater than the incentives for philanthropists in the UK to give. And so, in terms of the sort of economic history of American and British institutions and their interactions, we can't deny that the baseline comes from this sort of fact that Americans were really able to give, were incentivized to give in the moment when the foundation was started. And there were two passionate lovers of Soane, whose husbands were working in London in banks, who were visiting, et cetera, and decided, you know what, Americans need to have a way of contributing somehow. And so when they moved back to New York, they started the Sohn Foundation. And, it was very much a sort of, setting out flyers, mailings on the dining room table and building it piece by piece into another institution, that could really help the museum in a significant way. But it came out of that moment of Americans knowing they could help, knowing that other Americans would want to help, and sort of trying to find a way to catalyze it. And the two founders that I mentioned were particularly successful in building this audience in New York, right? And the one I've gestured to includes architects and designers and interior designers, but the museum contains some of the most fascinating drawings in the world, in my opinion, which I studied when I was in grad school. Paintings that are extraordinary and special. And so one of my hopes for the foundation is that we both expand nationally to host events across the country, and also to sort of build on our foundation in the design world by reaching out more to museums in America, other arts-oriented organizations, to interact more around those themes, which are so important to the Soane Museum in London.
So I have one more question on the museum.
Yeah.
And then I'm going to turn our discussion to Michael and Michael's experiences in the art world, because they're fascinating. And I don't want to miss an opportunity to discuss those with him. But one thing which I'm fascinated about, if you live in Europe, particularly in the UK, one of the biggest issues is restitution of colonial era artifacts. It's in the news all the time. President Macron of France just commissioned a 250-page report on what France should do with the objects that were stolen or looted, mostly from Africa during really the late 19th century, earliest 20th century. And that is an issue which all British institutions have had to struggle with. Interesting in the UK, because it also, lots of small regional museums in the UK are dealing with this issue. Because what would happen would be, let's see, after in China, after the looting of the Summer Palace, the soldiers would loot, bring the material, the objects back to the UK, to their houses or things like that, and they would. A lot of them would eventually, some would end up in the British Museum, but some of them would end up in these little small regional museums, and it has become a very complicated issue for museums to deal with, and rightly so. But when I was talking to Michael, I asked him, well, how does the Soane Museum deal with this issue?
Yeah. In the past, they've been dealing with it for a while through a series of histories that the curators have been writing on objects with complicated pasts. And so they've been interpreting this sort of complicated history for a while, which I'm proud of, and I think that they were doing the right thing in doing that. They're currently working on a report to trace the provenance of any of the antiquities in the building more carefully. I mean, it's been done, but I think, as you know, advances in art history mean that both on a material level as well as on a sort of archival level, we're able to conduct much more sophisticated analysis of an object's history now than we were even 10 or 20 years ago. So they're engaged in a review of all of the objects, And undergirding all of that is a really happy fact that I think, gives me a little bit of relief, although I'm just the American cousin. Most of the antiquities in the Soane Museum are fake. Because it was a teaching laboratory, right? It's not the British Museum. And that's a really delicious thing for us. So Soane was not trying to have a collection of antiquities to rival the British Museum. He got into a few tussles with them over a few very specific objects, and Christie's existed in Soane's lifetime. So the British Museum and Soane might have been bidding on the same item at auction. That's a fascinating history from an art market perspective. But most of that material
Are plasters.
are plasters that were used.
You should
for
probably
teaching
explain to everyone, because
Yeah.
I didn't know about plasters before I moved to the UK.
Yeah.
And there is a whole history of plaster casts being made. The Victoria and Albert Museum has a wonderful
Yes,
collection.
the cast
So maybe
court.
describe that a little bit.
Yeah. So, I mean, we know in figure drawing, you work from a model. You observe the human figure in the flesh. And in the context of architectural instruction and practice in Soane's lifetime, and today, actually, where classical architecture is taught, students were exposed to the real deal. Let me rephrase that. It wasn't always real or authentic material, to forms that were derived from antiquities that the students could study in the round, right? Because it's so important when you're creating ornament or decoration to really understand how it's modeled in space. They were also very concerned with understanding the proportions of Greek and Roman architecture, and actually also Persian architecture, Indian architecture at the Soane Museum. Soane had this sort of fascination with the architecture of all cultures, which is a strain of romanticism that is kind of specific to Soane's time. But as an instructor at the Royal Academy, he was giving lectures, and then he was inviting students into his house and museum to sketch. And so these plaster casts made from antiquities, but they're not antiquities themselves, were teaching tools. And this tradition was widespread in the UK, and if anyone has been to the cast court at the V&A in London, you've also seen these gorgeous casts that they're material culture from the 18th or 19th century, right? So they're precious now to us, and they're antiques now, but in their time they were just everyday objects that could be used.
And their history
for this
isn't as
purpose.
complicated.
And the
some of
history is not as complicated because they're made out of plaster. If you pour water over
Yeah.
them, they'd melt,
Yeah.
So.
And they weren't looted.
And they weren't looted. They were produced in London often, yeah.
So now I'm going to turn our discussion to Michael, whose background I find fascinating. I'm going to start by talking about objects. I absolutely love objects for the stories that they tell, the history, the cross-cultural dialogue that happens with objects when they cross from oceans. Michael has is passionate about objects, and I learned from doing my homework about him that his personal history with antiques has a story that includes a pink tractor trailer.
Oh, wow. You really did your research, Beth.
So tell us a little bit about the pink tractor trailer.
So as some of my old professors know, I'm from Alabama, and as I learned over the years, hearing stories from my mother, both her mother, my grandmother, and my grandfather were involved in the antiques trade. My grandfather was an upholsterer, interestingly. I don't know if I mentioned it in that setting, but he was. And my grandmother was an antique dealer. My mother has a complicated relationship with her because she was never able to use the kitchen in their houses, which was always interpreted as a period kitchen. And so my mom describes sort of tiptoeing into the kitchen and opening a can of Vienna sausages or whatever because the stove couldn't be used. It said it was all set up with antiques. She's deeply resentful. And at the end of her life, her mother sort of got rid of most of her possessions and became a sort of antique stealer on the road with all of the material loaded into a pink trailer. And that's how she pursued her final years with abandon and antiques. My mother inherited some of those.
In the pink tractor trailer.
Yeah, loathed them, and they sort of represented this life that she didn't want, and sold them at auction. And I was raised initially in these sort of, gray carpeted 80s houses with hardly any furniture. So therefore, of course, I had to become interested in material culture and old things.
Funny how life works.
Yes, that pendulum.
Tell me about, I know one of the focuses of your work at the Winter Show, and now John Soane, is about getting young people to be interested and engaged in the world of antiques. Because I think there has been this minimalist wave that has come across culture. And there are people like Michael who are encouraging young people not to forget all the beautiful things which make up our background and our culture. And tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so when I joined the Winter Antique Show, there was a prevailing sense that young people were not interested in historic objects, historic art, that there was declining interest, that we were sort of on this slippery slope to no one being interested in old things someday. And I understand why that narrative developed especially since 2008. The antiques market has been, in a trough, unfortunately. And, we can talk about other cultural dynamics that make it seem as if younger people aren't interested in history or in older things. But I was identifying something very different, both as a professional and also just, as a millennial who is interacting with friends who are fashion designers or historians or just, people who want to furnish their homes nicely. I was seeing that younger people love color, love pattern, love history, are very eclectic in their sensibilities generally, and that what some of my colleagues were describing as a downturn in interest really expressed something that was happening with people in Gen X. Sorry if any Gen Xers who love history are here. I know many. Many of my colleagues are in that generation and love material culture. But there was this minimalist wave that peaked in the 90s and early 2000s that we can associate with IKEA, with sort of other touchstones of minimalist culture. And in the world I work in, mid-century modern became more popular than ever as a collecting category, or it increased in popularity over the decades, and it really reached a zenith in the 90s and early 2000s. And in some way, we're still in that wave. If you know stores like West Elm that produce mass market furniture, you'd think we're still deeply in it. But that's not what I was seeing. I was seeing that people who wanted to live in interesting environments were turning to vintage and antique material to furnish them. I was seeing friends who were designers turning to history for inspiration in their work. I was seeing friends who are activists cultivating sort of newly sophisticated ways of talking about history, of thinking about history and making other people think about history. And so from the time I started with the Winter Show on, I think I began talking about this more and more, and hopefully convincing my older colleagues that young people are not a problem, and therefore we should engage with them and not just talk hopelessly about them. And also trying to make sure that younger people who haven't been exposed to historic material culture or art are exposed to it.
So I would also call Michael a chronicle entrepreneur, because all these ideas that he has, he actually acts on them. And so this idea that he had about engaging young collectors, he actually went and founded the New Antiquarians. And guess what? It doesn't end there. He's just has a book deal to write a book called The New Antiquarians.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
So
no, this
tell us
is
about
really exciting. And The book will be forthcoming in fall of 2022 from the Monticelli Press in Phaidon, and it will feature 18 young people who collect and live with historic material culture. And so it's a very gratifying thing for me because I get to tell that story in the form of a book, and I get to both write it, which again, my professors will know makes me very happy because I get to conduct a writing project. But I also am working very closely with a brilliant photographer, Brian W. Ferry, who's shooting the interiors created by these young collectors. And so, in connection with my work for the Soane or the Winter Show, I'm getting to go into these spaces and sort of imagine how they can be represented best. And it's just a completely fun project from every perspective. And we'll have hopefully a vibrant life out in the world once it's published.
I'm curious, what does a new antiquarian collect that us old antiquarians don't?
Well, some of them are just old antiquarians to be, and so like my thesis is not that people are fundamentally different.
Right.
Some of them are truly not at all different. They're just sort of like reverentially, following in the footsteps of the collectors they've admired. What I'll say, and I'll be very explicit about this, is that the book does not only follow or feature sort of moneyed young collectors who can sort of easily go out and buy whatever they're curious about. Those people exist. We're very happy for them, and they can do incredibly interesting things because they have the resources to support that kind of collecting practice. But we're also featuring people who go to Brimfield or to sort of junk markets, who collect stones, who collect objects that are inherently historical, but that are not necessarily derived from contexts that have commercialized those types of objects. So it's going to be a diverse assortment of collectors. And I do think that's an important narrative because if we want people to engage with history, we have to make it really clear that we're not closed-minded about what constitutes history or an acceptable antique, etc. I mean, we can talk about standards of quality. That's really important in the context of an art fair or a museum. But in someone's collecting practice, it's not all about the quality of the objects. It's about the lives of those objects, what they mean to the collectors, etc. So we do focus a lot on those sort of dimensions of collecting that maybe haven't been explored as much in the past.
So as we'll ask one last question, and then I'll open it up to anybody who has a question that they'd love to ask Michael. My final question will circle right back to COA. As a graduate of the class of 2009, Michael knows this institution very intimately. He knows what a COA education means, and I sense that it's in his DNA. So tell us about coming to COA, why you chose COA, and how, if it has had an effect on the choices that you've made in your life going forward.
Yes, it continues to have an effect on everything about me and my life. I'm also married to a COA alum, and so,
I didn't know.
we're completely bought in. There's
Yeah.
no escape from our love for COA or the effects it has on our lives. I come from rural Alabama and learned about COA because Martha Stewart visited it on her show, and my father was watching Martha Stewart living and said, "That place looks pretty." And he knew I was looking at New England liberal arts colleges. And so unbelievably, that's how I learned about COA. And, indeed, when I showed up, I think I was the only one from that class who'd come because of Martha Stewart. And I was one of the few Southerners. And I remember a group of students not quite bullying me, but sort of being very suspicious about why I smelled so good in line at Tab. And I was like, I showered. Like, I showered. But I had a very winding path after that. And, it's because I was 17 and from a completely different context. I had never really interacted with women who didn't wear makeup all the time. I mean, I'm from the deep South. And so for a minute, I was like, why do women look so different here? They're not wearing a full face of makeup 24 hours a day, right? So I did all sorts of things: critical theory, writing, philosophy, architecture, history. I'm like gesturing to my beloved professors in the audience. I think at times I probably looked confused. I was confused. But the sort of takeaway now is that unlike some of my friends and peers whom I adore and respect and look up to, I don't have a sense that my career needs to narrow down into one thing. And I think that makes a difference every day. So no matter what I'm doing, there are always projects on the side or ahead that sort of fulfill different parts of me. If I'm doing something that's very oriented towards, visual culture, I'm also likely working on a writing project in another part of my life. And I've been lucky to be able to build a career that allows me to move between different types of work that I'm sort of equally passionate about, and to not feel that I have to resolve it down into one thing. And above all, that is the effect of COA, is letting me have that and not feel like I have to just select one path and follow it doggedly until I retire,
Fantastic.
Yeah.
So are there any questions or anybody would like to follow up on something with Michael or Theo in the back?
Can you tell us more about stone collecting practices?
Yeah, I can tell you a bit. So Soane was a working class kid, which I didn't know. I loved the Soane. I spent a lot of time there when I lived in London, but his father made bricks, okay? And Soane was essentially discovered by someone from the Royal Academy who spotted him in the context of his father's work and helped him get a scholarship to go to the Royal Academy. So the baseline here is that Soane comes from this background where he wasn't exposed to collecting. He was exposed to the building trade, but not to the lives of architects and their clients necessarily. So in Soane's collecting practice is always this sort of dimension of wanting to create a world for himself that could sort of hold his originality and his persona. And there was certainly an aspect of self-fashioning in it, just trying to participate in London society so that he could become the architect of the Bank of England, so that he could become the architect of the Royal Hospital Chelsea, so that he could have the kinds of clients that were needed to sustain a practice like his. There was a self-fashioning instinct. And I think that's probably something that was happening earlier in his career, and we could talk about how he was trying to collect so that he could appear in society as, a sort of tastemaker and as someone who had something to say about architecture and art. But as his practice developed, it both, developed the aim of supporting his teaching practice. His own intellectual explorations and tastes became wackier and more fascinating as he grew older, which is exactly how it should be. And so on the one hand, he was collecting contemporary art. He was collecting Hogarth's Rake's Progress, which is at the museum. And that was cutting edge at the time. He was friends with the painter Turner. And so when he has a Turner in his collection, it's because he was engaged in a dialogue with Turner, not just as a patron, but as a buddy, a very close buddy. So there's also this sort of like collecting that we might think of in the context of 1970s New York. Do you know where someone like ends up with 3 paintings by their friend who happens to be an Abex painter, and then 40 years later they're worth $15 million? But like, that's not why he had them. He had them because his friend made these things. And then he was also very, this actually really inspires me today. He also just collected straight into categories that fascinated him, regardless of all of this other stuff. So he was passionate about Shakespeare. He collected a Shakespeare folio. There was just this very kind of focused pursuit on surrounding himself by things he loved and was passionate about. And because he was a sort of spatial thinker, he doesn't just collect a folio, he builds a recess in the building to sort of house his Shakespeareana. And that's the kind of, his vision was very complete in that way, you know? The collecting was always tied to his sort of personal fascinations and also to a design practice, so.
Go ahead.
You said that a lot of the material in the museum is reproduction. So did he know at the time, or did he disregard the provenance of his objects, and he was just interested in sort of representing? How did that happen?
So all collectors of antiquities throughout, you know, modern history.
Could you repeat the question just so the folks watching online can catch that?
Yeah. So what is your name again?
Michael.
Yes. Michael asked if Soane knew that the plaster casts in the museum were not authentic. And the answer is yes. I mean, they were very explicitly plaster casts made for teaching and learning.
Was he responsible for having them made, or they had been made previously?
A bit of both. And I think what's really, one of the things that I think about in history generally is how small a context like Soane's was compared to ours. So, you know, in London in the late 18th century, the early 19th century, there were only so many people doing this kind of thing, right? And there was a lot of exchange between them. And so I can't speak to the sort of provenance of every plaster cast by any means. I'm just the American cousin who's sort of still, in fact, learning a lot about the details of the collection. But Soane, his colleagues at the Royal Academy, other architects knew what they were dealing with plaster casts. And likewise, they collected the drawings of each other and of their predecessors. So Soane bought Robert Adams' archive. He also bought George Dance the Younger and Elder's archives. He bought still more archives and one of Elizabethan country houses. I mean, endless things. And in addition to material we would think of more as art historical, like Piranesi's drawings, that still have a huge impact on architectural history. And, you know, why collect all of those things if you're a famous practitioner yourself? Well, I mean, Google didn't exist, coffee table books didn't exist. So the plaster casts, the drawings, the prints that he could get a hold of were the sources of inspiration that he could bring into his own practice and also into the practices of his employees. So, I mean, I've talked about the students, but there were also, you know, he had an office. And so it's like, look at how so-and-so did it. Look at how that's modeled. We want to see it like that. These were the tools that allowed that to be expressed. Were there fakes floating around then? Yes. Are there fakes floating around now? Yes. And that's you know, regardless of the Soane Museum context, I could talk for hours about, you know, discussions with the Egyptian consulate during the winter show, you know, receiving a call, what is that thing in the aisle? Well, it's this. That's what the dealer says it is. It's what it is. We have a vetting process. That's not always enough, depending on, you know, to satisfy the interests of collectors, curators, or representatives of governments that are engaged in restitution efforts. So, you know, it's just a complicated topic, but fakes continue to abound, just not at the Soane Museum.
So, okay, I think we have time for just two more questions, quick ones. Lissa has her hand raised.
Michael, could you tell us a little more about your trajectory from COA to this role as a new antiquarian? I'd love to know what those different phases.
Sure.
So let me just quickly repeat the question for anybody who's not here in the room. So Lissa was asking about Michael's trajectory. How did he get from COA to what he's doing now as a new antiquarian?
It was slightly nonlinear. And I think that everyone involved in COA can understand that. Right after COA, I went to MUCI, the UWC in India, to teach. So I spent 2 years in India teaching. I even taught a course at COA during that period. I then went to London to study literature. And the sort of like center point, I suppose, in this narrative is that I'm passionately interested in literature. I write fiction, you know, like all of us, we all have multiple interests. And I was really happy pursuing that. But my work always came back around to architectural history and art history, no matter what I did. Do you know, so I would be setting out for the British Library and I would literally go to the Soane Museum instead. You know, I mean, that's what was happening throughout my literature degree. So at the end of that degree, I was thinking of studying a literary topic at Oxford, and that was sort of the path that appeared before me, and it was very academic, and it was embedded in the literature world. And I just thought, hold up, I need something isn't feeling right about this. And that's when I studied at Sotheby's. I studied architecture, art and art history and the decorative arts, and in an object-focused way. You know, I'd been doing a lot of theory, I'd been immersed in literature and philosophy, and I was missing the sort of context of objects and their histories that I knew so well from my adolescence and my time on the island even, and we could talk about those connections. But long story short, I immersed myself in the study of objects, and through that, I decided I didn't really need to enter academia to engage in the practice I wanted. That would have set me on a path towards a PhD, which would have been many more years of study. I just fell into the art market instead, and I got to begin working with historic objects and art history in the flesh immediately, and in the context of art fairs. The path to the Soane comes because increasingly I worked for nonprofit art fairs that supported a nonprofit beneficiary. And so in a very COA way, I was able to sort of move towards the sort of world of nonprofit institutions while maintaining my connection to the arts in my career. And I'm very grateful to have been able to do that. And I really do think that the influence of COA allowed me to think imaginatively at those turning point moments and to make decisions that were a little risky for me personally and that were maybe, you know, the implications of which were not always obvious to people who were following my moves. But, you know, this is what we do. We're scrappy. And so I was able to land in a context where I get to think about, I get to engage in nonprofit leadership. I get to think about architectural history and art history every day, and to think about how to communicate to new and younger audiences about all of these things.
So one last question. We have a very, since I promised from this side of the room, one quick last question,
Sure,
and then our time is up. Go ahead. Yeah. Sorry.
Would you give just a verbal description of one of your favorite pieces at the Soanes and why it's one of your favorite pieces?
Good
Wow.
question. Okay, so the question is our final question, which is a great way to round up. Thank you very much. Can Michael please pick one of his favorite objects at the Soane Museum, tell us why it's his favorite object, and obviously describe it to us so that we can join his journey.
I'm going to cheat a bit and say that my favorite object is the building itself. All of the objects in the museum are fascinating, but none of them would be as noteworthy or interesting if they weren't contained within this incredible shell that was designed to present them in a way that was very specific to Soane's vision. I'll just give you a few quick highlights. Soane was a master of color and light and their handling. And so when you're in the museum, you experience in some spaces a sort of dim, subdued atmosphere that he associated with the Gothic and with the mysterious lighting that you see in cathedrals. In other spaces, there's brighter light coming in through clerestory windows, which he put stained glass in to affect the quality of light. And so as you move through the space, you're always experiencing light differently in a way that's very connected to the things that 20th century practitioners think about. And also, artists who work with light. And I think to me, that's the most, I could go on all day, but like that, the quality of the light and the care with which the spaces have been designed to house the objects is to me the high point, if I had to choose one. And some of you may have seen images of the breakfast room, which has been very influential among architects. Philip Johnson modeled the domes in the brick guest house at the glass house on them. Robert Venturi and Denise Scott Brown have spoken extensively about Soane's influence on them, particularly his work at the Dulwich Gallery, inspiring their addition to the National Gallery in London. I could go on and on, but one of the fun things about the breakfast room is it has this canopy dome that looks weightless. It looks like someone has just put a sort of handkerchief in the ceiling, and it's just sort of floating there. And Soane, over time, lined it with tiny little convex mirrors. He also put convex mirrors in the pendentives. But you have here a domed room, and in the 18th or 19th century, we saw a lot of those, but this one is distinctly different from the minute you step into it, even though it's a small room. The proportions are very specific, and they create a sense of sort of weightlessness in the ceiling, and the light is just spectacular. And the reflections, everywhere you go, you see sort of a different atmospheric condition, let's say. So that's my favorite thing.
I wanted to thank everybody for coming today. A particular thank you to Michael. It's always nice, the college always appreciates every expert, politician, person who comes to speak to us. And we're particularly proud when they're one of our own. So thank you very much, Michael, and please come back.
Thank you, Beth. It was an honor being here. Thank you for coming. And a real honor to do it in this building, in this new space. So thanks, everyone.